In this lecture, we're going to see what is available to you in terms of networking in Qt Quick. First off, I want to mention that in your Qt development, the resource-heavy operations should be done on the C++ side. We have mentioned before that there are two major sides to working with Qt. You can develop your application in C++ purely, or you can do your user interface in Qt Quick, which is what the company behind Qt is pushing for now. They are pushing to do user interfaces in Qt Quick and do resource-heavy operations in C++ because that's much more scalable. Right here, you can see C++ classes that give you magic powers in terms of networking. You can do very low-level things in networking using TCP and UDP classes. You can really do anything. You can do DNS using the QHostInfo and QDNS lookup classes. You can do SSL and TLS. You can use these two classes. And they provide high-level classes to work with HTTP. You can use QNetwork Access Manager and QNetwork Reply. We have looked at this in one of my previous courses on Qt. So if you are working on the C++ side of Qt, these classes are going to come in handy. But we are not talking about those in this course because this course is purely about QML. On the Qt Quick side, there really isn't much you can do in terms of networking. There are a few things they allow you to do through JavaScript. Here I have listed two use cases I find important. One is being able to load QML components remotely. In this case, you serve your QML files through the internet, and your application is really like a web application. You are serving your user interface through the internet, and it is really like loading a web page, but you are loading QML. This is what they are trying to emulate. I just want you to know this use case. We are not going to go into too much detail about it because personally, I haven't used it that much. And you can consult the documentation if you need more information about this. What we are going to look at in this chapter is XML HTTP request, which is a JavaScript object that you can use in QML, and you can use it to fetch HTTP data. Now we want to look at what you can do with XML HTTP request. We are going to come to the documentation, the JavaScript documentation available at developer.mozilla.org. They have much more details about JavaScript, and this is the place to go if you need to read more on things you use in JavaScript in your QML. We have mentioned this in the JavaScript section of this course. So you use XML HTTP request objects to interact with servers. You can retrieve data from a URL without having to do a full page refresh. They talk about these things. Despite its name, XML HTTP request can be used to retrieve any page of data, not just XML. Down here, they show you the constructor. We are going to use this to create our object. And if you look at properties, there are a few things we're going to use in a moment. One is on ready state change. We are going to use this event handler to know if we had the data or if we got some kind of error while fetching our data from the internet. Okay, down here you see the ready state values. You can click on this to see the possible values. It can be unsent, opened, headers received, loading, or done, which is when the operation is complete. Another thing you might be interested in is the response text, which is the response from the server that you get. Returns the text received from a server following a request being sent. Another thing I want you to look at is the status. Returns an unsigned short with the status of the response of the request. There are standard HTTP status codes that are going to be returned in here. I think they even have a link on that. The status codes returned are the standard HTTP status codes. And if you click on this, open this in another tab, you're going to see those. You have 200 when everything is okay, you got what you wanted. You have 404 when the page is not found and things like that. Let's look at 404 page not found. You can look at all these statuses. They are available to you. Okay, now that we have a little bit understanding about the XML HTTP request object and what it does, let's look at how we're going to use it. First, we are going to use it to fetch some HTTP data. We are going to download a web page, and we are going to write a function like this to download the data. It's going to take a URL that we want to fetch. We're going to create a new XML HTTP request object. You create it like this. We just looked at the constructor in the documentation, and we listen in on this handler on ready state change. Okay, we put in a function that is going to help us capture the data. And if ready state is headers received, we just say that we received the headers. The most important thing we want is to know when the request is done, and we capture that when the ready state is XML HTTP request done. After that, we capture the data that is stored in response text, and we turn that into a string. After you get the text, you can really do anything with it. In this case, we are just stuffing this text in a text area UI component, the text property of it. And if the status is not 200, meaning that we didn't get what we wanted, we say that something went wrong. After we define our XML HTTP request, we open it by passing in the URL that we got from the caller of this function, and then we send our request. This is really how you use this object of XML HTTP request. And when you have this, you call your method like this by passing in a URL. We're going to do a demo about this. Don't worry if this is not clear yet. It is going to be clear, and you're going to see it work in action. One thing I want to mention is that what we did here is synchronous, meaning that it can block your user interface if this download here happens to take longer. Imagine if it takes something like 5 seconds or 10 seconds to get the data. If your network is slow, that can happen. It is going to block your user interface, and users are not going to be able to interact with your application. So this should be used on really fast operations that don't take that long. I even recommend not using this unless you really have a good reason to do so, because you can do this call asynchronously. To call asynchronously, you pass a callback method that is going to be called when the operation is done. And when this method is called, you can do your normal things like grabbing the text and using it in your user interface. So the difference with the synchronous call is that when you get the data, okay, you see that it looks mostly like what we had before, but after we have the data, we call the callback method with whatever data we got from the server. You see, we are calling callback, and we are passing in the response text, and we call toString on that to turn that into a string that we can work with in QML. If we don't get the response, we call the callback method with null to mean that we had an error, and then we kick off the download the same way we did with the synchronous call. It really is the same thing. The difference is that when you get the data, you call the callback method. Now, how do you call this method in your application? The download data method. This is how you do it. You call download data, and you pass in the URL, and you pass in an inline function that is going to act as your callback. So when we get the data, this function here is going to be called. You see that it takes a parameter, which is the response here. We check to see if the response is not null, and then we work with the data that we got from the server. In this case, we are taking the data and also stuffing it in a text area UI component. If the response is null, we say that there was some kind of error. This is really how you work with it. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is to download HTTP data. The second thing is going to be to fetch RESTful APIs and work with the JSON data that we get in our Qt application. Again, this is going to build on the foundation that we built when we downloaded HTTP data using XML HTTP request. The function to fetch data is going to look like this. You see that we are passing in the URL. This is the URL. And we are passing in a callback method. We get the response. This response is going to be JSON data. So we want to parse the JSON data into an object. This is what we do here. After we get the object, we loop over it, capturing the data that we want. This is also going to be some kind of object. We are basically capturing the data that we want and stuffing the data in a list model like this. The thing I want you to notice is that we are passing in a JSON object here, And this thing that is in quotes is going to be our role. And we are going to use this in our delegate to capture the data that we show in a list view, which is what we're doing next really. This is our delegate component. It's nothing special. We've done most of these things before. We have a rectangle inside with a bunch of properties. Inside we have a text component that is going to display our data. But the text property can use a role of joke, which is what we had before here when we appended the data in the model. This is what I want you to see. You can use joke here, or you can even use model data that we have used before when we have a direct model. You can look at the model view architecture chapter if you haven't looked at that yet. This is going to make sense. Okay, this is all we're going to cover in this chapter. In the next lecture, we're going to start by downloading some data from the internet using XML HTTP request. I'll see you there.